When pressure rises, most people lose control. Not because they are weak, but because they have never trained calm. They try to fight the stress. They push through the pressure. They tell themselves to stay strong. And they fail not because they lack the strength, but because they were trying to force the calm rather than building it. Calm is not something you force. It is something you build. And the building is what this audiobook provides. Introduction. Why calmness is a skill, not a personality. Calm people are not born different. They are trained differently. The myth of the naturally calm person is one of the most consistently disabling beliefs available in the context of developing calm under pressure. The belief that some people are simply constituted toward calm, that the quality is a personality trait distributed unevenly at birth, produces the specific learned helplessness of the person who has decided they are not one of the naturally calm people and has therefore exempted themselves from the development of the capacity. The belief is wrong. And the wrongness is specifically enabling the capacity that is developed rather than distributed is available to anyone who develops it. The distinction between calm and suppression is the foundational clarity that makes the genuine development of the calm possible rather than the attempted development of the suppression that is frequently mistaken for it. The suppression is the prevention of the emotional experience, the management of the external presentation, while the internal experience is being held down through the regulatory effort. The suppression is brittle, it holds in comfortable conditions and collapses under genuine pressure because the regulatory resource required to maintain it is the same resource that the pressure is depleting. The genuine calm is the maintained quality of the internal state, the regulated emotional experience, the governed behavioral output, the clear thinking in the conditions that the pressure is producing. The genuine calm is built, not forced. It is built through the consistent daily practice of the specific regulation and thinking disciplines that this audiobook develops. The building takes time. The built calm is durable in a way that the forced suppression is not, because it is based on the trained architecture rather than the strained effort. Chapter 1. Why calmness is power. Calm is not passive. It is control in its purest form. The specific power of the calm in the pressure context has been developed in several earlier audiobooks of this series, and is stated here in its most direct form. Calm is the condition that preserves access to the full cognitive architecture in the conditions that the pressure is specifically trying to shut it down. The calm person in the high-pressure situation has access to the clear thinking, the full attentional field, the deliberate assessment, and the governed behavioral output. The not-calm person in the same situation has access to the stressed, narrowed, emotionally amplified, urgency-driven version of each of these. The quality difference in the cognitive architecture available to each is the specific power of the calm. Calm versus weakness is the first distinction to establish. The cultural association of calm with passivity, with the absence of the visible emotional engagement that the reactive response produces, is the association that most consistently misreads the calm person's quality. The calm person is not less engaged with the genuinely significant aspects of the situation. They are more effectively engaged. Their full cognitive quality is available for the genuine engagement rather than being consumed by the management of the activated emotional state. The calm is the condition of maximum effective engagement, not minimum engagement. How calm affects perception is the specific quality of the broader attentional field that the regulated internal state maintains, the field that includes more of the actual features of the situation, more of the contextual information, more of the signal set that the activated tunnel vision excludes. The calm person perceives more of what is actually happening and less of the distorted, amplified version of it that the activation state produces. The fuller, more accurate perception is the foundation of the better decision, the more precisely calibrated response, and the more effective engagement with the genuine requirements. Why calm people dominate high-pressure situations is the specific accumulation of the preceding advantages: the fuller perception, the clearer thinking, the more accurate assessment, the more precisely calibrated response, all available from the calm person's regulated starting point and all degraded in the not-calm person's activated starting point. The dominance is not the dramatic assertion of superiority. It is the quiet, consistent, situation-to-situation quality advantage that accumulates into the specific social assessment of the person who can be counted on in the demanding conditions. Chapter 2. What pressure does to you? Pressure does not change the situation, it changes you. The specific changes that pressure produces in the person navigating it are the changes that this entire series has been describing from multiple angles: the neurological changes of the stress response, the cognitive changes of the attentional narrowing and the working memory flooding, the behavioral changes of the urgency-driven reactive output. Each of these changes is real, specific, and specifically addressed by the practices in this audiobook. The stress response is the foundational change, the physiological activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the release of cortisol and adrenaline, the redirection of physiological resources toward the survival response. This is the biological mechanism through which the pressure produces the cognitive impairment. The cortisol flooding reduces the working memory capacity. The adrenaline increases the heart rate and the movement urgency, and the combined physiological state is the one from which the thinking and the behavior are being produced in the pressure context. Fight, flight, or freeze is the behavioral expression of the stress response. The three primary behavioral patterns that the activation state produces in the absence of the deliberate governance that the trained calm provides. The fight response is the aggressive escalation, the defensive assertion, the combative engagement with the pressure source. The flight response is the avoidance, the withdrawal, the retreat from the engagement with the pressure. The freeze response is the paralysis, the decision inability, the behavioral shutdown that the overwhelming activation can produce. Each of these is the specific behavioral output of the specific stress response pattern. None of them is the deliberate, governed, calibrated behavioral response that the situation genuinely requires. Loss of rational thinking is the specific cognitive consequence of the stress response, the specific reduction of the deliberate evaluation capacity, and the corresponding increase in the automatic pattern-matched processing. The rational thinking requires the deliberate, sequential, evidence-based evaluation that the prefrontal executive functioning supports. The stress response suppresses the prefrontal executive functioning. The result is the rational thinking deficit that registers as the rushed assumption, the emotional conclusion dressed as logic, and the reactive response that felt like a decision. Chapter 3. Why you lose control. You do not lose control suddenly, you lose it step by step. The loss of control in the pressure context is not the sudden catastrophic failure of the regulatory system. It is the gradual erosion of the regulatory resource through the accumulated demands of the pressure environment, until the threshold is crossed where the remaining resource is insufficient to maintain the governance that the control requires. The erosion is gradual and invisible. The control is present until the threshold crossing, at which point it appears to have been lost suddenly. The gradual erosion is the actual mechanism. The apparent sudden loss is the threshold effect. The trigger-duration chain is the specific sequence through which the control is lost in the acute pressure moment. The trigger arrives and the emotional activation begins. The activation consumes regulatory resource. The regulatory resource that remains after the activation is the resource available for the governed response. If the remaining resource is sufficient, the governed response is produced. If the activation has consumed more resource than remains sufficient, the reactive default takes over. The reactive output is produced. The governed response is not available. The control is lost in the specific moment. Lack of awareness is the specific condition that makes the control loss most likely and most surprising. The person who is aware of the activation beginning, who notices the early physiological and cognitive signals of the regulatory demand, can apply the regulation practices before the activation has consumed the resource required for the governed response. The person who is not aware of the activation until it has progressed to the point where the resource is already significantly depleted must apply the regulation from the position of the reduced resource, a significantly more demanding starting point. Habitual reactions are the third condition, the established neural pathways through which the specific triggers produce the specific reactive outputs with the automaticity of the well-predicated pattern. The habitual reaction does not require the exhaustion of the regulatory resource to execute. It executes before the regulatory resource has had the opportunity to engage. The trigger fires, the habitual pattern executes, and the reactive output is produced before the aware, regulated, deliberate response is available. The management of the habitual reaction requires the specific rewiring practice, the consistent application of the alternative response in the presence of the trigger, building the competing neural pathway until the alternative is the more automatic response. Chapter 4. Controlling your emotional response. You cannot stop emotions, but you can stop them from controlling you. The emotional response to the pressure situation is genuine and appropriate. The activation, the urgency, the intensity of the emotional engagement with the genuinely significant aspects of the situation are the accurate responses to the genuine features. The control of the emotional response is not the elimination of the emotional experience. It is the specific governance of what the emotional experience produces as behavioral output and as cognitive input, which is the entirety of the difference between the controlled and the uncontrolled emotional response in the pressure context. Emotional awareness is the prerequisite for the emotional control, the specific attentional practice of monitoring the internal state with sufficient accuracy to recognize the activation before it has progressed to the level where the governed response is no longer available. The awareness is the early warning system, the recognition that the activation has begun, at the level where the regulation is most accessible, before the regulation has become the demanding restoration of the lost control rather than the maintenance of the present control. Naming versus reacting is the specific cognitive practice that converts the undifferentiated activation into the specific, labeled, accessible emotional experience. The named emotion "I am angry because this feels unjust" rather than the undifferentiated activation is the emotion that can be assessed. Is this anger proportionate to the actual features of the situation? Is the unjust assessment accurate? What behavioral response does the genuine assessment warrant? The naming is the beginning of the assessment. The assessment is the beginning of the governed response. Regulation versus suppression is the distinction that keeps the emotional control practice from becoming the brittle management of the external presentation that collapses under sufficient pressure. The regulation is the maintained quality of the internal state through the specific practices: the breath regulation, the awareness practice, the naming practice, the deliberate slowing that address the activation at its actual sources rather than concealing it beneath the managed exterior. The suppressed exterior collapses under pressure. The genuinely regulated internal state does not collapse because the regulation is real rather than performed. Chapter 5. Calm thinking under pressure. A calm mind sees what a stressed mind misses. The specific cognitive contents that the calm mind sees and the stressed mind misses are the elements of the situation that the attentional narrowing of the stress response excludes from the tunnel vision field: the contextual information that would moderate the catastrophized assessment. The options that are not urgency consistent but are genuinely more effective. The longer frame consequences that the time horizon compression of the stress response excludes from the assessment. The calm mind sees these elements because the broader attentional field of the regulated internal state includes them. The stressed mind does not see them because the narrowed attentional field excludes them. Thinking clearly in the stress context begins with the minimum viable regulation sequence: the breath that reduces the physiological urgency, the physical settling that sends the regulated state signals, the brief deliberate attention to the actual features of this situation stripped of the emotional amplification. This sequence is the prerequisite. Without the partial restoration of the deliberate cognitive mode that the regulation provides. The clear thinking in the stress context is the thinking from the activated state dressed in the language of the deliberate evaluation. Avoiding panic decisions is the specific practice of the decision delay in the pressure context: the maintained commitment to the minimum viable decision process rather than the immediate commitment to the urgency-driven option. The panic decision is the decision made from the urgency of the panic rather than the deliberate assessment of the genuine requirements. The minimum viable decision process produces the better decision in the time that the genuine temporal requirement allows, which is almost always more time than the panic is representing as available. Maintaining perspective in the pressure context is the specific cognitive discipline of keeping the situation assessment within the accurate proportions: the actual risk level, the actual consequence of the available options, the actual temporal urgency rather than the inflated proportions that the stress response is producing. The perspective is maintained through the deliberate application of the time frame extension: what does this look like in a week? The scope assessment: what specifically is within the scope of influence here? And the genuine uncertainty acknowledgement: what do I actually know? And what am I assuming? Chapter 6. Behavior under pressure. People do not respect what you say under pressure. They respect how you act. The behavior that the pressure produces, the behavioral output that the activated state generates in the absence of the deliberate governance, is the most directly observable and most reliably assessed quality of the person in the pressure situation. The words can be chosen, calibrated, managed. The behavior in the genuinely demanding moment is the expression of the actual internal state rather than the presented one. The people in the social environment read the behavior with the specific accuracy of the social intelligence system that is calibrated to distinguish the genuine from the performed. Controlled behavior in the pressure context is the specific quality of the behavioral output that is produced by the deliberate governance rather than the automatic reactive expression. The controlled behavior is not always the calm, composed, visibly managed exterior. It may include the firm assertion, the direct expression of the concern, the clear communication of the position. What makes it controlled is not the specific emotional quality of the content, but the origin. The deliberate assessment produced the behavior rather than the activated state executing the reactive pattern. Slower actions in the pressure context are the behavioral expression of the regulated internal state, the specific quality of the movements, the speech, and the behavioral pace that communicates the regulated state rather than the urgency of the activation. The slower actions are the physiological signals that reinforce the regulation. Each deliberate slowing of the behavioral pace is a physiological input to the brain that the urgency level is being reduced, which supports the reduction of the activation level. The behavioral slowing is both the expression of the regulation and the practice that deepens it. Intentional responses in the pressure context are the specific behavioral outputs that were produced by the deliberate assessment rather than the automatic execution of the reactive pattern. The intentional response is chosen from the genuine assessment of the situation, the genuine evaluation of the options, the genuine selection of the response that the situation's requirements warrant. The choosing is the governance. The intentional response is the expression of the governed mind. Presence is the quality that the intentional responses produce over time, the specific social quality of the person who is consistently there, consistently engaged, and consistently producing the deliberate response that the situation actually requires. Chapter 7. Building mental stability. Stability is built when nothing is wrong. The counterintuitive precision in the hook is the most important single insight in this chapter. Mental stability is not built in the demanding situations where it is most needed. It is built in the ordinary situations where the building is most possible. The demanding situations test the stability that has been built. They do not build the stability. The building is the daily practice, the ordinary situations, the consistent application of the specific habits that accumulate the neural infrastructure that the demanding situations will draw on. Daily regulation is the specific maintenance practice for the cognitive and emotional quality that the demanding situations will require. The brief morning regulation practice that establishes the starting baseline for the day. The regular awareness check that monitors the internal state and catches the drift toward the overload before the drift has reached the control loss threshold. The deliberate recovery practice between the demanding periods that restores the regulatory resource before the next demand requires it. Each of these is a daily maintenance investment in the stability that the demanding situations will test. Nervous system training is the specific physiological dimension of the mental stability building, the consistent practice of the physiological regulation that trains the nervous system toward the parasympathetic baseline rather than the chronic sympathetic activation that the sustained pressure without recovery produces. The breath practice, the deliberate physical slowing, the regular genuine recovery practice, each of these is a training input to the nervous system that builds the regulated baseline from which the demanding situations are engaged rather than the activated baseline that makes every ordinary demand a regulatory challenge. Preventing overload is the specific management practice that keeps the regulatory resource above the threshold required for the maintained stability, the deliberate management of the cumulative demands of the pressure environment. The active seeking of the genuine recovery before the depletion reaches the level of the control loss, and the honest assessment of the current regulatory resource relative to the upcoming demands. The prevention of the overload is the most efficient form of the stability maintenance, restoring the regulatory resource before the loss of stability requires the more demanding restoration from the depleted state. Chapter 8. Training calmness daily. You do not become calm in chaos. You bring calm into chaos. The specific direction of the causation and the development of calm is precisely what the hook establishes. Calm is not produced by the chaos. Calm is brought into the chaos by the person who has built it through the daily training. The chaos cannot produce the calm. The chaos is the test of the calm. The training is what builds the calm that the test will reveal. And the training occurs in the daily, ordinary, low-activation situations that allow the consistent, progressive, repetition-based building of the specific neural infrastructure that the calm consists of. Repetition is the mechanism, the specific neural pathway building that occurs through the consistent application of the specific practices across many ordinary instances over sufficient time. Each instance of the breath regulation in the ordinary frustration is a repetition of the regulation capacity. Each instance of the deliberate slowing in the ordinary pressure is a repetition of the pacing discipline. Each instance of the awareness practice in the ordinary activation is a repetition of the monitoring habit. The repetitions accumulate into the capacity. The capacity is the calm that is brought into the chaos. Small daily habits are the specific behavioral level of the training, the individual practices that constitute each day's investment in the calm capacity. The morning breath practice, a deliberate pause before the first response and the first difficult conversation of the day. The physical settling before the entering of the demanding environment. The brief reflection at the end of the day on what activated the system and how the activation was managed. Each of these is individually tiny. Each is a practice session. The sessions accumulate. Mental training as the framework for understanding the daily practice converts the individual habits from the arbitrary self-improvement activities into the specific, purposeful training sessions for the specific capacity that the demanding situations will require. The athlete does not wonder why they train daily when the competition is months away. They train because the competition will require the capacity. And the capacity requires the training. The daily calm practice is the same logic. The demanding situation will require the calm, and the calm requires the training. Chapter 9. Staying calm in real situations. The real test is not practice, it is real life. The real situations where the trained calm is most specifically tested are the situations where the training was always hitting the work pressure of the genuine professional crisis. The conflict situation of the significant relationship difficulty, the social tension of the high-stakes interpersonal dynamic, and the unexpected stress of the sudden difficult development that arrives without preparation time. Each of these is a specific deployment context for the trained calm, the situation where the daily training either produces the available capacity or reveals the remaining gap. Work pressure as the testing context is the specific environment where the combination of the performance demand, the time pressure, the social dynamics of the professional relationship, and the genuine stakes of the professional outcomes creates the specific pressure conditions that most consistently test the calm capacity. The calm in the work pressure context is the maintained quality of the thinking, the behavioral governance, and the relational quality in the conditions where the urgency, the performance anxiety, and the interpersonal dynamics are each generating their specific regulatory demands simultaneously. Conflict situations as the testing context add the specific dimension of the interpersonal activation, the reciprocal escalation dynamic, the status threat, the emotional charge of the significant relational difficulty to the cognitive and behavioral demands of the pressure context. The calm in the conflict context is the specific quality of the maintained regulation in the face of the other party's activation, the maintained deliberate assessment in the face of the emotional content, and the maintained governed behavioral output in the face of the reciprocal escalation pressure. Unexpected stress as the testing context is the most demanding of the three because it arrives without the preparation time that the anticipated stress allows. The unexpected development, the sudden bad news, the unforeseen complication, the abrupt change in the situation tests the baseline quality of the trained calm, the capacity to regulate and engage with the genuine requirements of the situation without the support of the anticipatory preparation. The baseline quality is what the daily training builds. The unexpected situation is what the baseline quality is for. Chapter 10. Becoming unshaken. Calm is not something you reach, it is something you become. The unshaken quality that this final chapter names is the identity-level expression of the developed calm, the point at which the calm is no longer the effortful maintenance of the trained practice but the natural expression of the developed character. The unshaken person is not the person who is never activated or never challenged. They are the person whose activation, when it occurs, is met with the trained regulatory response rather than the reactive default, and whose character is expressed consistently across the comfortable and the genuinely demanding conditions. The identity shift from the reactive to the calm is the product of the accumulated evidence of many instances of the trained response in the situations that genuinely tested it. Each instance where the breath was taken before the reactive output, where the slowing was maintained against the urgency, where the deliberate assessment produced the response rather than the activation, each of these is a piece of evidence for the identity of the person who does these things. The accumulated evidence builds the identity. The identity sustains the behavior. The virtuous cycle produces the unshaken. Long-term calm baseline is the specific neurological and behavioral expression of the identity-level development, the regulated starting point from which all the situations are engaged rather than the activated starting point that the untrained default provides. The long-term calm baseline is the daily practice accumulated investment made physical the nervous system trained toward the parasympathetic regulation, the attentional habits built toward the deliberate direction, the thinking habits built toward the structured assessment. The baseline is the architecture. The architecture is the calm. The calm is who you are. Emotional resilience as the quality of the unshaken person is the specific capacity to be fully activated to feel the genuine intensity of the genuine difficulty and to return to the regulated baseline through the trained regulatory response rather than remaining in the activated state or suppressing the experience. The resilience is not the imperviousness. It is the built capacity for the return. And the return capacity, expressed consistently, is the specific quality of the unshaken mind that the pressure reveals as present. Closing. The calm that controls. You do not need to eliminate pressure. You need to stop reacting to it. The pressure is the permanent condition. The reaction is the learned, trainable, changeable response to it. The training is what this audiobook has provided. The daily practice is what makes the training into the built capacity. And the built capacity, deployed in the real situations where the pressure is genuine, is what changes the experience from the loss of control under pressure to the maintained calm that controls the response to it. Once you stay calm, you do not just survive the pressure. You control it, not the external circumstance. The control of the external circumstance is not always available. The control of your own response to it. And the control of your own response is the only control that is always available. In every situation, under any pressure level, to the person who has built the trained calm that this audiobook develops. You have built the calm, now bring it into everything.